It was the sort of late summer morning that made one forget entirely about the possibility of death, let alone something as vulgar as murder. The sky stretched cloudless and blue above the neat thatched roofs of St. Mildred's, a village so picturesque it could have been painted on the side of a biscuit tin. Bees hummed contentedly among the lavender bush, the church bell had just rung 10, and the soft tap-tap of a cricket match on the green mixed with the rustle of Sunday clothes, being shaken out for tomorrow's service. In the cozy sitting room of Lavender End, Miss Jane Marple poured tea with her usual unhurried grace, the fine china clinking faintly as she passed a cup to her visitor, Mrs. Amelia Harmon, the vicar's wife. "Only a quarter teaspoon of sugar," Mrs. Harmon said with the tone of someone imparting a medical secret. "I'm avoiding starches this fortnight. Dr. Bertram says one must consider cholesterol even at our age." "Quite right," murmured Miss Marple, though she added 2 generous lumps to her own cup. "We mustn't court danger, but we ought to keep cheerful, too." The 2 women sat companionably at the round table beside the bay window, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains and turned the room a pale gold. On the table was a plate of scones still warm from the oven, a pot of homemade damson jam, and a tiny dish with Miss Marple's worn silver thimble, set aside from her recent darning. Mrs. Harmon, whose tongue moved as nimbly as her fingers arranging altar flowers, was expounding on her latest crisis, the collapse of the Harvest Festival Flower Committee. Edna Vickers claims she can't distinguish between white and cream carnations, and poor Nellie Pratt had the nerve to suggest artificial ivy, artificial in the house of the Lord. Miss Marple made a soft sound of sympathy but wasn't entirely listening. Her pale blue eyes, sharp despite her years, were drifting past her guest and out through the window. A thin trail of smoke was curling lazily into the sky above one of the neighboring houses. "How odd," she murmured, almost to herself. "There's smoke coming from Colonel Fawcett's chimney." Mrs. Harmon turned, curious. "Is that strange? It's rather damp today." "It is," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But Colonel Fawcett is an unusually methodical gentleman. He has his chimney swept the first week of October every year like clockwork, and he never lights a fire before then. Claims it disrupts the creosote cycle." "You do remember the most peculiar things," Mrs. Harmon chuckled. Miss Marple smiled, her fingers gently turning her teacup. "One can't help noticing, when one lives alone, little rhythms, little rules people set for themselves. It's often in the breaking of such habits that mischief begins." "Mischief?" Mrs. Harmon raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Jane, you do make everything sound like a detective story." Miss Marple didn't reply. Instead, her gaze lingered on the stately stone house 3 doors down Ashcroft Hall, as it was still called, though the Colonel lived there alone with only a housemaid and a gardener. The ivy climbing its east wall had grown thick over the years, giving the place a kind of dignified seclusion. But there was something quietly out of joint about it today, the smoke from a chimney that should have remained cold, and a flutter of movement behind a curtain that fell too quickly. Moments later, Colonel Arthur Fawcett appeared in his garden. His gait was stiff but proud, his tweed jacket immaculate, the silver tip of his walking stick catching the light. A retired officer of the Bengal Lancers, he still conducted his days like campaign schedules. He squinted up at the chimney, lips pressed into a line, then disappeared into the house without waving to the women watching from Lavender End. Miss Marple's expression, though faint, was pensive. "Odd," she said again. The scream came just before 2 o'clock. Not the shrill cry of a child or the panicked bark of a dog, but a full-throated, breaking shriek that carried across rooftops and down lanes like a bell tolling over water. It came from the direction of Ashcroft Hall, and in the seconds that followed, the village seemed to ripple into action. Curtains were flung aside. Doors burst open. Mrs. Mapleton, the butcher's wife, dropped her knitting in the garden and stared open-mouthed toward Church Lane. Old Mr. Spinks hobbled out with his hearing trumpet reversed, muttering, "Bombs? Again, is it?" And a blackbird, startled from its perch on the vicarage wall, flapped upward into the hazy sky. Miss Marple, who had just sat down with her embroidery, placed it carefully on the armrest and reached for her shawl. By the time she arrived, a hurried but attentive small crowd had gathered outside Colonel Fawcett's front gate. The housemaid, Elsie Dobbins, stood in the gravel drive, her apron stained and her eyes wide with horror. "I didn't know. I didn't know," she kept wailing, twisting her hands in the folds of her dress. "He was just there, sitting by the hearth. He never sits there. I only meant to fetch the silver polish." Ivy French, a sensible girl of 19 training at St. Monica's Hospital in Truro, had taken charge of the situation and was gently guiding Elsie to a bench. She looked up with relief when the village constable, P.C. Rowntree, puffed into view, on his bicycle, cap askew, and notebook already in hand. Rowntree was young, a little too fond of rules and less fond of subtlety, but he meant well and did his best to bark orders. "No gossiping, thank you. All of you back home, please. This isn't the theater?" He and Ivy entered the house. Silence fell like a held breath. After what seemed like forever, they returned. The constable looked paler than before. "There's been an unexpected death," he said stiffly. "Dr. Lysander is on his way. I'll thank everyone, too. Go about their business and let us do our job." It was, of course, the perfect invitation to do the opposite. Back at Lavender End, Miss Marple sat once again with Mrs. Harmon, who had returned post-haste bearing a treacle tart for fortitude. "They say he was found by the fire, just sitting there." "Like he nodded off and never woke again," Mrs. Harmon whispered. "But why would the fire have been lit?" Miss Marple murmured, pouring more tea. "Well, perhaps he felt unwell. Perhaps he was chilled." "Perhaps," Miss Marple echoed. "But there's something quite deliberate about that chimney, you know. The Colonel was proud of that drawing room. He considered it a summer room. Had the Great Sealed last winter, told me so himself. He shed firelight distracted from his antiques." Mrs. Harmon's eyes narrowed. "Then why was it lit?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached across to spread jam on her scone, her fingers precise, her expression calm. "The things people do when they think no one's watching are always more revealing than the things they do in public," she said gently. "Lighting a fire in a sealed chimney? It suggests someone either forgot something or meant to hide something." And there was a silence between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock and the clink of a teaspoon. "I do hope it was natural causes," said Mrs. Harmon faintly. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "So do I." But in her eyes was a look Mrs. Harmon had seen only once before years ago, when the curate had vanished overnight with the organist's watch, and it sent a curious chill down her spine. By evening, the entire village was buzzing. The doctor had come and gone, the coroner had been notified, and the word unexpected hung in the air like fog over the moor. Miss Marple, after taking her evening walk, paused once more by Ashcroft Hall. She looked up at the chimney, the smoke long gone, but the soot around the flue dark and uneven. She watched, thought, listened, then quietly she turned and walked. Home, her shawl tucked closer around her shoulders. She had seen enough to suspect that something wasn't right. And she had seen enough to know that someone, perhaps even someone nearby, had planned it that way. By Saturday morning, the sleepy calm of St. Mildred's had been decisively disturbed. Though the official word regarding Colonel Fawcett's death was still pending medical review, no one in the village had any real doubt that something was amiss. In St. Mildred's, uncertainty was always a temporary condition of vacuum, swiftly filled with gossip, suspicion, and the comforting ritual of judgment. At the Greenfinch tea room, 2 tables had been pushed together to accommodate Mrs. Mapleton, Mrs. Ruddle, Mr. Pendry from the post office, and old Mr. Sims, who had a partial hearing aid and a habit of muttering louder than he knew. They spoke, in hushed tones made louder by the enclosed space and the collective thrill of forbidden speculation. "I heard it was poison," said Mrs. Ruddle, leaning in as though to keep the sugar cubes from hearing. "Right there in his tea. Or perhaps a fire lit to cover a smell. Arsenic, has an almond scent." "Smells of money to me," Mr. Pendry said dryly, folding his newspaper. He wasn't short, the Colonel. "No family nearby, but that niece Marion, is it? The one from London who drives a little car and wears trousers." Always had her nose in the silver cabinet. Mrs. Mapleton, whose nose was never far from anyone's silver cabinet, sniffed. Don't forget the gardener, Owen Cresswell. Always lurking about. That sort of man always feels cheated by people with big houses. Well, I heard, Mr. Sims began, that he'd just changed his will last month, cut someone out. Or put someone in. Made a row about it at the bank, loud as anything. This pronouncement was greeted with reverent silence, broken only when the tea-room bell jingled and Miss Jane Marple entered. She nodded pleasantly at the table of gossips, eyes serene, and took a seat by the window. Within moments, Miss Florence Finch herself brought her the usual one-buttered crumpet, a pot of strong Assam, and a folded napkin with a fresh sprig of mint tucked in. Miss Marple always noticed such details. Shame about the Colonel, Florence said softly, setting the tea down with care. Elsie came in crying for smelling salts this morning. Poor girl's quite undone. Yes, said Miss Marple, her tone gentle but neutral. It's difficult to lose someone one serves closely. One grows used to the routines of another life. Florence lingered. Some say it wasn't natural. Do they? Miss Marple stirred her tea. Florence leaned in, encouraged by the question. Smoke from the drawing room, you know. Elsie says the chimney was meant to be blocked. They only lit the fire because the room smelled odd when she came in from the garden. Like bitter herbs, she said. Miss Marple looked up. Did she now? Florence blinked, flustered. Not to everyone, of course, just to me. Miss Marple offered a mild smile. Of course. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, her gaze drifting once more toward Ashcroft Hall, visible just over the rooftops. The chimney no longer smoked, but something in the way the shadows fell along the eaves made the whole house appear subtly unsettled. Later that afternoon the Colonel's niece arrived. Marian Fawcett was a striking woman in her early 30s, all angular shoulders and cropped auburn hair. She wore a severe black skirt suit and narrow spectacles that gave her the air of a secretary with military clearance. She stepped from the train with no tears in her eyes, but a purposeful clip to her heels and a folded copy of the Times under her arm. She didn't even look upset, Mrs. Mapleton declared from her watchpost behind her lace curtains. Just walked up to the house and unlocked the door like she was returning from shopping. Miss Marple, who also observed Marian's arrival from a distance, though without lace curtains, thought otherwise. She had noticed the way Marian paused before inserting the key, as if taking one last breath before entering enemy territory. By dusk, Marian had summoned the Colonel's solicitor, Mr. Godfrey Lennox, and the two were seen in the drawing-room with the drapes pulled tight. A low, heated exchange drifted through the window before it was shut. Several villagers swore. They saw Marian flinch when she noticed the fireplace had been scrubbed hastily, the rug repositioned. That same evening, Elsie Dobbins left the house sobbing. She's been let go, Ivy French said softly to Miss Marple, whom she found in the church garden weeding the herb bed. Marian said she wasn't needed anymore. No warning, no thank. You just gone. Miss Marple, brushing earth from her gloves, looked toward Ashcroft Hall. And what do you think, Ivy? She asked kindly. The girl hesitated. I think something frightened Elsie. She's not just mourning, she's scared. I've seen that look in hospital wards. It's not grief, it's panic. Miss Marple nodded slowly. You're very observant, my dear. That's a quality to be cultivated quietly. Ivy flushed with pride. Sunday brought the inquest announcement. Dr. Lysander had submitted his preliminary report, death by asphyxiation, likely smoke inhalation. But the coroner had ordered further investigation due to inconsistencies in the ventilation system and residual chemical traces. The word suspicious was not officially used, but neither was natural. This news spread as fast as butter on a crumpet. Miss Marple received the information while tending to her roses. Mr. Pendry leaned over her low stone wall, ostensibly to discuss mildew spots, but eager to share the latest whisper. They say the inspector's being called in from Exeter, he said. Some sort of quiet look before things go to the press. Miss Marple straightened. Inspector Bullfinch, perhaps, or Reeves. Reeves, I think. Rather sharp? They say doesn't suffer fools. Ah, she said simply. And someone may suffer after all. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her sitting room fire, one properly swept and recently inspected, knitting a plain brown sock for one of her nephews. The room was quiet, save for the clock ticking and the fire crackling softly, but her thoughts were busy. The chimney, the fire, the change in routine, Marian's silence, Elsie's terror, Ivy's sharp eyes. Smoke where smoke should not have been. Miss Marple believed in signs, not omens, but signals. Things out of order, tea sets left rearranged. People whose habits changed too quickly. She did not leap to conclusions, but she noticed what others did not. And something had gone very wrong at Ashcroft Hall. The Colonel had not died by accident. Of that she was almost certain. She would wait, watch, listen. The killer, whoever they were, had made a single mistake already. She had seen it rise like a signal, thin, gray, and curling from a chimney that shouldn't smoke. It was Monday morning when Inspector Reeves arrived in St. Mildred's. Not with sirens or dramatic pronouncements, no, that was not his way. A modest black motor car pulled up to the village constabulary just after 10 o'clock and outstepped a compact, wiry man in a charcoal suit with deep-set eyes and a face like folded linen. Inspector Gerald Reeves of Exeter Division had handled a dozen quiet deaths in a dozen quiet parishes, and he knew the most dangerous places were always the ones where everything appeared perfectly ordinary. P.C. Rowntree, still rather pink-faced from the week's excitement, met him with deference and eagerness. "Morning, sir. Bit of a strange one, this. Village doesn't take kindly to scandal, I should warn you." Reeves gave a brief nod already, scanning the high street with a subtle glance. "No village does, but scandal rarely asks for permission." By midday, word of his arrival had spread. The Greenfinch Tea House reported a rush of customers just popping in for a bun. The grocer saw a sharp increase in foot traffic. Even old Mrs. Carter, who hadn't left her cottage since 1962 without her canary, was seen tottering up the hill with a spyglass poking from her handbag. But if Inspector Reeves was the object of curiosity, Miss Marple remained the center of quiet certainty. She had not yet spoken to the inspector. She had not even attended church on Sunday, which in itself had caused murmurs. "She's usually the first one in the pew," said Mrs. Harmon to Florence Finch. "Couldn't be illness. Her roses looked freshly trimmed. That's always a sign." The truth, of course, was simpler. Miss Marple was thinking. And as anyone who knew her understood, when J. Marple was thinking, she was dangerous. On Monday afternoon she paid a call to Ashcroft Hall. It was, outwardly, a friendly call, bearing a tin of shortbread and wearing her gentlest smile. Marian Fawcett answered the door herself, dressed in a tailored black dress and heels too, sharp for village gravel. Her expression shifted when she saw the older woman standing there. Surprise followed swiftly by calculation. "Miss Marple, isn't it? From the cottage on the lane?" "Yes, my dear," said Miss Marple, gently handing her the tin. "I brought these along. I hope they're not unwelcome, my own recipe. I imagine meals must be difficult just now." There was a pause, then Marian stepped aside. "You're kind," she said crisply. "Come in." The drawing room had changed. Gone were the porcelain dog figurines and embroidered runners the Colonel had favored. The room was cooler, cleaner, stripped of its former clutter. The rug before the hearth, however, still bore the faint shadow of where something heavy had been moved. "You've been very busy," Miss Marple said lightly. "I prefer things minimal. My uncle liked things dense." Miss Marple lowered herself carefully into the nearest chair. "He did enjoy a good knick-knack. Never threw anything away, not even receipts. I remember he once kept a broken sundial in his boot cupboard for over a year." Marian did not laugh. She perched rather than sat, her arms crossed loosely. "You knew him well, then?" "Well enough. We weren't intimate friends, you understand, but one learns a good deal from church committee meetings and war remembrance teas. He was a man of structure, detail. He kept to his habits." Marian hesitated. "Yes, he did." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was precise. Miss Marple, whose mind worked like a lace-maker's bobbins turning, crossing, twisting threads into shape used that moment to observe the mantel clock, the faint scrape of old soot behind the brass grate, the folded paper on the desk corner with legal letterhead still visible. "Did you ever stay here long, Miss Fawcett?" she asked softly. Marian blinked. "No, just a few days here and there. Business mostly. I'm in procurement, pharmaceuticals, Manchester. A serious field. You must be very careful with all those chemicals." Marian's lips tightened. Yes, one must be. As Miss Marple made her gentle departure, the front door closing with a soft latch behind her, she reflected on a single sentence Marian had spoken so casually it might have gone unnoticed. He kept to his habits, but how had Marian known that? She had said she rarely visited, she had stayed just a few days, and yet she had stated it like fact. Miss Marple didn't like inconsistencies, and she had no fondness for women who pressed down their skirts as if smoothing away truth. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the church steeple, Inspector Reeves paid a visit to Lavender End. Miss Marple greeted him graciously and poured him a cup of assam without asking. He accepted it with a nod, but his eyes steady, not easily. Miss Led studied her more than the floral wallpaper. "You know the village, Miss Marple," he said. "I'm told you notice things. I do try, Inspector. People are terribly informative when they think no one is listening. Reeves's mouth twitched in something not quite a smile. "I'm interested in Colonel Fawcett's daily patterns, his habits." Oh, he was a creature of the calendar. Breakfast at 7:15, regardless of season. Bacon, 2 eggs, toast, and marmalade. Sunday walks at 10:30. Letters always posted before noon. His fire remained unlit until after the chimney sweep October, every year without fail. "And this year, no exception," Miss Marple said firmly. "He told me so not a fortnight ago," said lighting it early made the flue groan like a ghost. Reeves sat back. "Then someone else lit that fire?" "Yes, she said softly, or wanted it to appear as though he had." There was a pause as they each sipped their tea, the air between them thick with a shared awareness that neither wished to put into words yet. Finally, Reeves asked, "Do you believe it was deliberate?" Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper. "I believe that someone understood the Colonel's pride in his order, his rituals. Someone used it against him." Reeves studied her. "Do you have a suspect?" "Oh, no, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently. "I never suspect. I merely observe. People tend to tell you who they are. One must only listen to what they try so very hard not to say." He didn't press further. Perhaps he knew better. As he left, Miss Marple stood by her garden gate, watching the chimney of Ashcroft Hall again. No smoke now. But something far more dangerous had already escaped from within, not gas or fire, but fear. By Tuesday morning, Inspector Reeves had established a temporary office in the vicarage library, an arrangement hastily approved by the Reverend Harmon, who secretly delighted in the sense of spiritual involvement in a real-life murder investigation. "It's not every day one's parish becomes the setting for a proper mystery," he whispered to his wife as Reeves arranged a modest stack of files on the side table. "Don't be ridiculous, Arthur," Mrs. Harmon muttered. "It's a tragedy, not a serial." Still, she had already changed the altar flowers to white lilac. In memoriam. Outside, the village swelled with speculation. The arrival of uniformed officers from Exeter, one of them dusting the hearth at Ashcroft Hall with a delicate feather brush, lent the entire affair a cinematic quality. "Poor man," Mrs. Finch said to Miss Marple as she served her morning bun, "to go like that, and in his own chair, too. There's something cruel in that, I think." "Cruel and clever," Miss Marple murmured, buttering her scone. "If it was meant to look like a moment of rest." Back at the vicarage, Reeves had begun interviews. First to arrive was Owen Cresswell, the Colonel's longtime gardener, a man in his late 40s with sun-darkened skin, permanent creases at the corners of his eyes, and hands that bore the rough polish of a life spent outdoors. He stood awkwardly in the room, hat in hand, eyes darting to the antique clock as if it might accuse him of something. "You were the Colonel's gardener for how long?" Reeves asked, leafing through a thin folder. 17 years, sir, Owen replied. And before that I worked for Mr. Hartford up in Nethercombe. I've got references. I'm sure you do. When did you last see Colonel Fawcett alive? Owen rubbed his neck. Day before he passed, Friday morning. I was deadheading the dahlias by the east wall. He came out for a minute, complained about the noise the jackdaws were making. That was all. Did he say anything unusual? No, sir. Just muttered and went back inside. He never liked a fuss. Reeves paused. Did you light a fire in the drawing room that day? Owen looked up, surprised. Me? No, sir. I don't go inside unless Elsie calls me for lifting or pipes or something. You didn't notice smoke? I did later, but assumed it was a cold snap. You never know with these old houses, drafts and such. Was the colonel planning to change his will? Owen hesitated. There'd been talk. He wasn't pleased with Miss Marion lately. She wanted to sell some of the old furniture, said it was time for modernity. He wasn't one for modernity. Reeves took that down. And you? Any reason to resent him? No, sir. He paid fare regular. Gave me a goose every Christmas. When Owen left, Reeves looked thoughtfully at his notes. Loyal servant. Perhaps, or just a clever one. Next came Marion Fawcett. She entered briskly, sat with authority, and spoke as if she were giving a quarterly report. I have no idea what happened, Inspector. My uncle was old, yes, but not frail. He hadn't complained of any illness. You found the house in order? I did, nothing out of place. Except the fire? Reeves said. She shifted. Slightly, yes, that. Elsie said it had been lit to chase off a smell. I told her not to light anything, especially with the flue sealed, but she's not very bright. Did you quarrel with your uncle before his death? We disagreed about the house, yes. I wanted to prepare it for resale. He was clinging to dusty traditions. But quarrel? No, Reeves narrowed his eyes. Were you aware he was reviewing? His will? Marion's eyes didn't blink. He threatened it often. I never took it seriously. Reeves leaned back. You've inherited everything? I believe so. Though I haven't read the will, you arrived very quickly. I was scheduled to visit already. His birthday was next week. Reeves watched her in silence for several seconds. You're in pharmaceuticals? Yes. Handle chemicals? I manage procurement, not compounding. Still, he said lightly, one learns a good deal about dosage. She gave a thin smile. Only enough to know what not to touch. Outside the vicarage, Miss Marple stood speaking with young Ivy French. They had paused beside the church's herb garden, where Ivy was assisting with late summer pruning. You're thoughtful today, Miss Marple said, eyeing the neat pile of clippings. I just don't like the way people talk about Marion, Ivy said, frowning. She may be blunt, but grief doesn't always look like sobbing in corners. I lost my mother at 13. I remember being angry more than sad. Astute, Miss Marple said softly. Grief wears many dresses. And Owen, Ivy continued, he's a good man. He helped mend our roof last winter, refused. Payment. I know the village likes to think the help always has a motive, but it isn't always so. No, Miss Marple agreed. But sometimes goodness and guilt look remarkably alike, and those who appear too calm may be simply exhausted from pretending. Ivy tilted her head. Do you think it was murder? I think someone changed a pattern to hide something, Miss Marple said gently. That usually leads somewhere dark. By the week's end, another name emerged. Dobbins. She had, Reeves discovered, received a sum of money from the colonel earlier that month. £50 recorded neatly in his account ledger with a simple note, to E.D., kindness over years. Reward or silence? Reeves wondered. Aloud, when questioned, Elsie trembled visibly. I didn't ask for it, sir. He just handed it to me in an envelope, said it was for new shoes. No one is accusing you of anything. Miss Dobbins, Reeves said, though his tone was less than reassuring. She was dismissed, tearful, unsteady, wringing her hands until her fingers turned white. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor knitting by lamplight. Her fingers worked rhythmically, but her mind wandered elsewhere. 3 names now stood in the village square of her imagination. Owen Cresswell, Marion Fawcett. Elsie Dobbins. 3 people who had reason to be close and therefore reason to be suspected. But motives, she reflected, were often like weeds. The obvious ones, jealousy, inheritance, revenge, sprouted quickly and broadly. The real root lay beneath, hidden, slow to show, but inevitable once disturbed. And someone, she was certain, had disturbed it. The week was waning, and the uneasy rhythms of St. Mildred's were beginning to settle into a new, uncertain pattern. The initial shock of Colonel Fawcett's death had rippled outward into suspicion and quiet fear. Yet beneath the surface, as Miss Marple well knew, the village continued to hum with its usual trivialities, arguments about the church pew cushions, the question of whether Miss Finch's prized dahlias had been overwatered, and Mrs. Harmon's ongoing efforts to rally volunteers for the harvest festival. But at Lavender End the air was thick with something more solemn. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, the soft ticking of the clock a metronome to her thoughts. Her knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she pored over the details she had gathered, the gardener's loyalty, the niece's cool demeanor, the housemaid's tremulous departure. Each thread tugged lightly, then loosened again, revealing only the faintest pattern. Yet it was a detail that came unexpectedly, small and overlooked, which would pull those threads tighter. Earlier that afternoon, while accompanying Ivy French to the vicarage to deliver a basket of fresh herbs, Miss Marple had taken the opportunity to pass by Ashcroft Hall once more. The house, wrapped in its heavy silence, looked more like a mausoleum than a home. The gardeners had left the rosebush unpruned, and the wisteria that usually bloomed in gentle cascades was now tangled and bare. As she stood by the low stone wall, a faint shimmer caught her eye, a slender scrap of paper caught in the ivy. Carefully, she leaned over and retrieved it. The paper was old, the edges frayed, but the ink remained dark. A note. Miss Marple's fingers trembled just slightly as she smoothed it out on her palm. It read simply, "The chimney's fire is not the only thing that must be hidden. No signature, no date." A cryptic whisper. That evening, after her supper of lightly stewed pears and thin toast, Miss Marple sat by her fire with the note pinned gently to her knitting basket. She considered it quietly, turning it over as if it might reveal more secrets in its folds. Who had left the note? Was it a warning or a confession? And what exactly was meant by "not the only thing that must be hidden"? Her mind raced through her recent conversations. The colonel, meticulous and orderly, had kept his routines rigid. Yet someone had deliberately broken those routines, lighting the fire in a chimney that was supposed to remain sealed. Was this note a taunt, a clue, or simply the nervous scribble of a frightened villager? The following morning, Miss Marple called on Ivy at her home. The small cottage was neat and bright, filled with the faint scent of lavender and fresh bread. "I found something at Ashcroft Hall," Miss Marple said, showing Ivy the note. The young nurse's eyes widened. "Do you think it's connected?" "I do," Miss Marple said firmly. "It suggests there is more to this than just a poorly timed fire." Ivy bit her lip. "There's a silence in the village, Jane. People don't speak of what they might know. They whisper around doors, but never inside." "Fear," Miss Marple mused. "Fear is a potent silencer," Ivy nodded. "And sometimes it's not just fear of the law. Sometimes it's fear of what others will think?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, the village's gaze can be harsher than any judge." Later that day she paid a discreet visit to the colonel's solicitor, Mr. Godfrey Lennox, at his office in the market town nearby. The man was mid-50s, precise in speech and attire, his office lined with leather-bound volumes and legal forms. When shown the note, Mr. Lennox frowned deeply. "I have not seen this before," he said. "But I can confirm," he added, that the colonel was unusually secretive of late. He had been revising his will multiple times, each version more complex than the last. "Why?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mr. Lennox sighed. His niece, Miss Fawcett, was not the only person with a potential claim. There were rumors of a distant cousin, a Miss Clara Hemming, who lives in Sussex. The colonel never mentioned her publicly, but he corresponded with her for years. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Hidden family, then?" "Exactly." and one version of the will left a substantial sum to a charitable trust, which might have angered some heirs. "Secrets," said Miss Marple. "They grow like weeds." As dusk fell over St. Mildred's, the village seemed caught in a hush. Miss Marple returned home, her mind alive with new questions. The note had shifted the case from the realm of accident or petty dispute to something deeper, more dangerous. She wondered if the note's author was watching her even now. Someone who believed their secret was safe. Someone who might soon try to silence another voice. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, a soft tap came at the door. Opening it cautiously, she found Ivy standing there, cheeks flushed and eyes wide. "Jane, you must come," Ivy whispered urgently. "Elsie Dobbins is at the pub, speaking. To some of the villagers, she's telling things. Things she swore she'd never say." Miss Marple nodded. "Lead the way, Ivy." At the Fox and Hound, the village pub, a small crowd had gathered around Elsie. Her voice was low but insistent. "She said she saw something at Ashcroft Hall," Ivy explained quietly to Miss Marple as they approached. "Something she shouldn't have, a quarrel," raised voices, and a package, wrapped in brown paper, that the colonel took from the study. Elsie spotted Miss Marple and faltered. I didn't mean to cause trouble," she stammered. "I just can't keep it in any longer." The pub fell silent, all eyes on Miss Marple. Miss Marple's gaze was calm. "Mrs. Dobbins," she said kindly, "sometimes the truth can be a kind of freedom." Elsie took a deep breath. "There was a man, a stranger, came to the house 2 days before the colonel died. They argued right in the drawing room. I heard it through the door. The colonel shouted something about ruining everything. Then the man left, but not before the colonel locked the door behind him." "Do you know who the man was?" Miss Marple asked softly. Elsie shook her head. "No, never saw his face." The room was heavy with questions. Miss Marple knew this new information was vital. A secret visitor, a heated argument, and a hidden package? The chimney's smoke, the note, the quarrel, all pieces now forming a puzzle, and Miss Marple, as always, was patient. She would wait until the picture was complete. The following days saw St. Mildred's quiet streets rippling with undercurrents of unease and suspicion. The fabric of village life, usually so tightly woven with neighborly pleasantries and benign gossip, had begun to fray along unseen seams. Small tensions and old grievances long buried beneath the polished surface of polite society now stirred to the light, their whispers growing louder with each passing hour. Miss Marple, who had spent much of her mornings in her garden tending her roses, now found herself invited to more and more conversations, not by accident, but by gentle design. The village sought her wisdom, or perhaps simply a confidant who would listen without judgment. It was at the church hall on Thursday afternoon that the first real confrontation took place. The meeting had been called by Reverend Harmon to discuss arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival. The room was bright, but a charged atmosphere hung heavily over the gathering. Marian Fawcett arrived early, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the warmth of the late afternoon sun. Her entrance was met with a flurry of polite nods and a few carefully restrained glances. She had already begun to feel the weight of suspicion, and she bore it with a calm, almost defiant grace. Owen Cresswell arrived moments later, hands roughened by toil and eyes shadowed by worry. His usual quiet manner was replaced by a guarded wariness as he took a seat near the back. Elsie Dobbins, pale and restless, lingered near the refreshment table, avoiding eye contact. Ivy French, determined to keep the peace, hovered nearby. Reverend Harmon opened the meeting with his customary warmth, but his voice faltered slightly when he mentioned the colonel. "We are gathered to honor the memory of Colonel Fawcett, a man who served his country and village with dedication. But we must also face difficult questions and move forward together." Marian cleared her throat. "If I may," she said crisply, "I have every intention of restoring Ashcroft Hall and preserving my uncle's legacy. His death is a loss to us all, and I will do what I can." Her words were sincere, but some in the room exchanged glances. Miss Marple noted the subtle shift in tension, the line between sympathy and suspicion. After the formalities, a woman rose quietly from her seat, Mrs. Mapleton, whose sharp eyes missed nothing, spoke with a tremor of anger. "I must say, Miss Fawcett, that some of us find your sudden appearance and rapid control over the household rather unsettling. The Colonel was well liked here, and we all mourn him. But it's hard not to notice how quickly you have taken charge." Marian met her gaze steadily. "My presence is necessary. I am the next of kin. It is my right and my responsibility." "But the village remembers the Colonel's kindness to those who served him," Mrs. Mapleton retorted. "Elsie Dobbins, for example, gave many years of loyal service. Yet she was dismissed without notice." "That hardly seems kind," a murmur rippled through the room. Elsie's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. Marian's jaw tightened, but she did not reply. Miss Marple raised a hand gently, drawing attention. "Perhaps," she said softly, "there is more to this than appears on the surface. Loss can manifest in many ways, and decisions made in grief are not always easy." Her words calmed the room like a gentle breeze. Marian's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. Later that day, Miss Marple found Owen near the churchyard, tending the freshly planted rosebush. He glanced up as she approached. "You seem troubled, Owen." He wiped sweat from his brow. "It's hard, Miss Marple. This village. It's like a pressure cooker. Everyone wants answers, and the finger points at me as much as anyone." "Do you think you could have hurt the Colonel?" He shook his head vehemently. "No, I worked for him nearly 2 decades. I respected the man." "Yet you admit there were disagreements over the house and the will?" "Yes, but that's nothing new. Family squabbles, money matters. The things people argue about in every village. I never wanted harm to come to him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In the days that followed, whispers of another visitor to Ashcroft Hall reached Miss Marple's ears, a man seen arriving late one evening. His identity unknown, his purpose mysterious. She pressed her inquiries carefully, learning that several villagers had glimpsed a stranger, a tall figure in a dark coat, moving cautiously near the estate just days before the Colonel's death. When she mentioned this to Inspector Reeves, his eyes narrowed. "We'll have to dig deeper," he said. "Anyone coming and going unseen in a village this size raises a red flag." Meanwhile, Marian's composure showed signs of strain. A letter arrived that she read alone in the drawing-room, her face pale but resolute. Miss Marple, who happened to be visiting nearby, noticed Marian's unusual stillness when she later saw her at the vicarage. "Is everything all right?" she asked with gentle concern. Marian gave a brittle smile. "There are complications, old family matters long buried." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Those are often the hardest to forget." That evening Miss Marple met with Ivy and Elsie in the quiet safety of her sitting room. Elsie's hands trembled as she recounted a moment that had weighed on her heart. "I never meant to speak out," she said, "but I saw the Colonel angry like I never had before. He told Marian something I didn't understand. About a secret that could destroy us all." "What kind of secret?" Miss Marple asked softly. Elsie shook her head. "I don't know." But after that, he was never the same. Ivy looked at Miss Marple with wide eyes. "Do you think it's connected to the note?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Most likely. Someone wanted to keep more than just the chimney quiet." As night fell, the village seemed to hold its breath. The harvest festival preparations continued in muted tones, but the undercurrent of fear and suspicion deepened. Miss Marple, gazing once more toward Ashcroft Hall, felt the invisible threads pulling tighter. She knew the coming days would reveal more. Secrets would surface, alliances tested, and the true heart of the mystery would beat clearer. All she had to do was wait and watch. Rain had returned to St. Mildred's in quiet, intermittent drizzles, never quite a storm, but persistent enough to dampen spirits and turn the footpaths to slick ribbons of mud. Under leaden skies, the village trudged onward with forced civility, but beneath it all stirred a restlessness, a waiting. The Colonel's death had not settled into memory, and the mystery clung to the hedgerows like the morning mist. Miss Marple, wrapped in a rose-gray shawl, sat by her sitting-room window, knitting untouched in her lap. She was thinking. thinking, as always, not in straight lines, but in 1,000 soft tendrils that reached into memories, people, peculiarities, and contradictions. One thing she knew: people seldom meant what they said, but they always revealed what they feared. A sharp knock broke her reverie. Mary, the maid, opened the door to reveal Inspector Reeves, looking unusually grave. "May I come in, Miss Marple? I believe we have something new." She gestured him to the armchair opposite. "Tea? Or shall we go straight to the matter?" He declined the tea, removing a sealed envelope from his coat pocket. "This was posted anonymously to the station early this morning. No return address, but the postmark is local." He opened it carefully and laid the contents on the table between them. A photograph. A grainy black and white image, clearly taken with a cheap camera, showing the unmistakable shape of Ashcroft Hall's smoking chimney on the night before the colonel was found dead. Miss Marple leaned closer. "Interesting." "Very," said Reeves. "According to Marian Fawcett, the fire was never lit that night. She had been staying in the east wing and claimed the main hearth hadn't been used. No servants lit it either, yet here it is, smoking." And in the background, he tapped the photo. You can just make out a silhouette. Possibly someone standing in the drawing-room window. Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Her gaze was fixed not on the figure, but on a small shadow near the chimney pot. An outline, a bird, no too square. Where did this come from? We don't know. But someone clearly wanted to remind us that Marian's version of the night isn't the whole story. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "And perhaps," she said, "it's not just her story that's incomplete." That afternoon the village buzzed with a new wave of rumor. Word of the photograph had inevitably leaked, perhaps through a careless constable or an observant postmistress. St. Mildred's had a way of knowing everything before it was officially said. At the Green Man pub, Mr. Pritchard, the butcher, was declaring that he'd always suspected Marian. "Too refined by half," he muttered into his pint. "Came back like a queen reclaiming her throne. I say it was her what lit that fire too? Cover-up summit." Mrs. Mapleton, sipping her sherry near the hearth, was less certain. Or perhaps someone else was already in the house that night and she never knew. Meanwhile, Elsie Dobbins sat in Miss Marple's kitchen, wringing her hands. "I should never have left that night, Miss Marple. I know I was dismissed, but something told me not to go. And when I passed the rear garden gate, well, I thought I heard someone moving behind the tool shed." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Slightly. Did you see anything?" "No, just a shape. Could have been a fox for all I knew, but the garden, it was too quiet. The colonel's house was never quiet like that, not unless he was away. Was he expecting visitors?" "Not that I know. But I found the drawing-room window unlatched earlier that day. I thought nothing of it at the time." Miss Marple's mind was already sorting these fragments into place, not quite a picture yet, but a frame was forming. "Inspector Reeves," called a second interview with Marian Fawcett. This time her poise cracked. "You think I lied about the fire?" she said, her voice taut with anger. "We think the photo raises questions," Reeves replied. "Would you like to explain how the chimney could have smoked if no fire was lit?" Marian hesitated. Then, unexpectedly, she began to cry. "I didn't lie, but there was someone in the house that night. I heard them. I thought it was a dream." She sat down, shoulders hunched. "I was in bed early. I'd taken something to help me sleep. I heard footsteps, very soft but distinct. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. I couldn't bear the thought of being wrong, so soon after arriving, I needed the house to feel safe. Why didn't you tell us before?" "Because I thought it would ruin me. That people would say I imagined it, or worse, that I was complicit." Inspector Reeves remained expressionless. "Did you see anyone?" "No." Miss Marple, present at the interview by quiet invitation, asked a single question. "Did your uncle ever speak to you about anyone he feared?" Marian looked at her. "Once. He said there were debts in the family that weren't just financial, and that someone would do anything to erase them." That evening, a new character stepped into the scene, a young man named Derek Lansing, who had arrived by bicycle and was seen inquiring about rooms at Mrs. Culpepper's boarding house. Word traveled fast. Miss Marple watched from her garden gate as Derek made his way down the lane. He was tall, sun-browned, with the lean look of someone who had recently come off a long journey. He carried a satchel and a camera. Curious? She murmured. By dusk, she had confirmed with young Tommy Simmons, who delivered newspapers, that Mr. Lansing had been seen several weeks ago loitering near the edge of Ashcroft Estate, claiming to be a landscape photographer. But no photographs had ever surfaced. Miss Marple, naturally, arranged to bump into Derek the next day at the grocer's. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "We don't get many photographers in St. Mildred's. You must be drawn to our glorious skies." Derek smiled politely. "Actually, I'm tracing family connections. My mother was a Fawcett. I heard about the Colonel's death and thought I'd pay my respects." "Oh, how touching," Miss Marple said, eyes narrowed kindly. "And did your camera happen to capture any memories of Ashcroft before the sad event?" Derek hesitated. "A few," she nodded. "I do hope you still have them. Photographs can be so revealing." By the end of the week, Miss Marple's suspicions had not crystallized, but they had narrowed. The chimney that shouldn't have smoked was not merely an architectural quirk. It had concealed something, an arrival, a presence, a moment of violence, or perhaps a cover-up of something older. She stood once again at the edge of Ashcroft's overgrown garden and looked up at the darkened chimney stack. In the still air, she could almost see the shadow of someone standing at the hearth, watching the fire flicker, waiting for it to burn away something incriminating. But what, or whom? Ashcroft Hall stood quiet again, its chimneys unsmoking, its windows blind. The police had made a second sweep of the grounds, Inspector Reeves looking tighter in the jaw with every passing day, while the villagers whispered about the stranger at Mrs. Culpepper's and whether the Colonel's niece was really as refined as she claimed. Miss Marple had not been idle, quiet, yes, retired, never. She had spent the past few days asking careful questions of those who wouldn't think to question her in return. She spoke to the grocer's boy about who came and went at odd hours. She spoke to the vicar's wife about the legacy of the Fawcett family, especially how they'd fared financially after the war. And she spoke, most critically, to Mrs. Mapleton, whose cousin worked at the bank and let slip something rather useful over a shared cup of chamomile tea. The Colonel had made a sizable cash withdrawal a fortnight before his death, he said. "It was to settle an old debt," Mrs. Mapleton repeated with relish. "A family matter, apparently." "But no trace of that cash was ever found after he died?" Miss Marple only smiled. "Money, dear Mrs. Mapleton, has a way of being both everywhere and nowhere." It was on Friday afternoon, as the light began to mellow across the rooftops of St. Mildred's, that Miss Marple enacted her quiet little test. She invited 3 people to tea. Marian Fawcett arrived first, elegant as ever, dressed in soft brown wool and wearing gloves, though the weather hardly required it. Her smile was tightly drawn, but her voice held up. Derek Lansing came next uninvited, but not unwelcome. He claimed to have run into Miss Marple's maid in the village and heard she was receiving. And lastly, to balance the group, Miss Marple had gently insisted that Reverend Blackwood join them, under the pretense that she wished to consult him on the church fete arrangements. They gathered around Miss Marple's sunny little parlor. The lace cloth on the table was spotless, and the tea came with shortbread, cherry scones, and lemon curd. Marian nibbled politely. Derek refused sugar. The Reverend consumed everything with cheerful energy. "I do hope, Mr. Lansing, Miss," Marple said sweetly, "that you've managed to see the old church since your arrival. It has quite the collection of memorial tablets, some dating back to the 17th century. Fascinating reading." He offered a half-smile. "I'm not much of a churchman, I'm afraid." "Oh, but you have an eye for heritage, don't you? You said your mother was a Fawcett?" "She was. Distant cousin to the Colonel." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Then you must know of the unfortunate incident involving Colonel Fawcett's father." "What was it? Embezzlement from the regimental accounts?" Derek's cup rattled slightly as he set it down. "I wasn't aware." "Ah," she murmured. "Perhaps it was kept quiet. Families often do with these Embarrassments. There was a silence that followed, not long, but tight as a pulled thread. Marianne Fawcett's expression didn't change, but her hands curled faintly on her lap. "And yet," the Reverend added cheerfully, unaware of the tension, "what? Family doesn't have a blot here or there." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "I once knew a woman in Much Benham who used to host charity suppers with stolen silver from her mother-in-law. Nothing is ever quite what it seems, is it?" Derek shifted in his seat. "That's rather a strong comparison." Miss Marple turned to him with wide, guileless eyes. "Oh, I only meant that things people often have different faces. We see what we're meant to see, but we don't always notice what's underneath. I've always believed behavior tells more than words." After tea, she asked the Reverend to walk her to the green to discuss hymn selections. The other two guests departed, and she watched Derek as he descended the front steps. He hesitated briefly at the gate, glancing behind him toward the house. Then he moved on. "Did you see that?" she asked the Reverend. "What's that?" "Never mind," she said, smiling faintly. "Just watching the wind turn, that's all." That evening, Miss Marple received another unexpected caller. Elsie Dobbins, the dismissed housemaid from Ashcroft, arrived looking flustered, holding a box. "I didn't know what to do with this," she said breathlessly. "It turned up in my post this morning, no note, just this little parcel." She unwrapped it to reveal a tiny wooden figure crudely carved, hollow inside and scorched at the edges. A scent of old smoke clung to it. Miss Marple held it up to the lamplight. "A chimney sweep," she said softly. "Yes, but look here." Elsie pointed to the hollow base. Tucked inside, carefully folded, was a strip of thin paper. It read, "Ashes lie, but embers speak, you saw me." Elsie trembled. "I swear I never told anyone I saw something that night not properly saw, just a movement near the hearth end." "Now this," Miss Marple soothed her gently. "You've done the right thing, you always do, don't you, dear?" But inside, her mind was racing. This was a warning. To silence. But why warn Elsie, unless someone knew she'd seen more than she let on? And more pressing still, who sent it? Later that night, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Reeves once more. The hearth in her parlor was unlit, though the air was growing cool. She placed the wooden chimney sweep on the table between them. She was meant to be frightened. This was theater, not threat. Reeves frowned. "It's sinister." "Oh yes, but also clever. The figure, it's a message. About fire, of course, but also about silence. And secrets. I rather think our killer fancies himself poetic." "You say himself?" "I do." She reached for her knitting, though the needles did not move. Men are so often careless with details, even when they believe themselves to be artists of misdirection. But it's the careless flourish that gives them away. A woman would have used a lavender sachet. Or nothing at all. Reeves leaned forward. "Do you have a name?" She smiled. "Names are often less revealing than glances, Inspector. I find the best way to test a person is not to accuse them, but to ask them to help you. And if they're guilty, they can't help but show it one way or another." The following morning, Miss Marple received a small envelope through her letterbox. No address, no name. Inside was a single photograph. A photograph of her taken from the street, just outside her parlor window. She looked at it calmly, folded it once, and placed it in her knitting basket. "Well," she said aloud, "that's bold, but not," she thought, unexpected. Because Miss Marple had begun to suspect that the chimney hadn't smoked merely to hide a fire. It had signaled something, a rendezvous. And someone still close, still watching, was afraid she knew it? The following days passed in a brittle calm. August in St. Mildred's ought to have been a season of soft breezes and dozing bees. But the village had acquired a watchfulness, an invisible hush that even the wind seemed reluctant to break. Doors were shut more firmly. Curtains, especially those facing the road, hung heavier than usual. Miss Marple, ever observant, saw more than one neighbor pretend not to be standing at their window when she passed. The anonymous photo still lay in her knitting basket, buried beneath a half-completed tea cozy of blue and rose wool. She had not spoken of it to Inspector Reeves again, not yet, not until she was ready. Instead, she took a walk. A deliberate one. Her destination, Ashcroft Hall, the manor was quieter than ever. Only 2 windows were open, one on the upper floor, presumably Marian's room. The other was the small window off the kitchen, half-propped and fluttering a white lace curtain. She rang the bell and waited. It was Mrs. Culpeper who answered, her apron clean for once and her hair bundled into a scarf. She looked surprised to see Miss Marple, but not displeased. "Oh, Miss Marple, come in. Come and mind the steps." "I thought I might call on Miss Fawcett," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "I hear she's been keeping to herself lately. I thought a visitor might lift her spirits." Mrs. Culpeper hesitated, but then nodded. "She's up in the sitting room. Don't get many callers now. Inspector's been twice this week, poking about. Marian hasn't said much since the day they found that second piece of cloth in the chimney, burnt just like the first." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. "Second piece?" Mrs. Culpeper's expression tightened. "Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that, was I?" But Miss Marple had already begun her quiet ascent up the staircase. Marian was sitting by the window, still and pale as wax. A book rested in her lap, but hadn't been touched. She did not look surprised to see Miss Marple, only weary. "Please, don't ask if I'm well," she said. "No one is well in this house any more." "I shall skip the niceties then," Miss Marple replied, folding herself neatly into the armchair across from her, "and simply observe that sometimes grief has more than one root. We think we're mourning a death, when truly we're mourning the truth that came with it." Marian looked at her sharply. "I don't know what you mean." "But you do. I think the Colonel's will, for instance. It was never made public." "No, it wasn't. Strange, isn't it? He was a man of order, regimented. You'd expect a will filed promptly, especially with such an estate." Marian's fingers tightened around the book's spine. "I imagine the original copy was burned. Hidden first, then destroyed. Perhaps someone found it too." Revealing, "I wouldn't know." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "I don't suppose you would. But someone would." She let the silence settle, smooth as silt. Marian said nothing more. Outside, the sky darkened slightly. Clouds gathered, heavy with a storm that hadn't quite made up its mind. As Miss Marple left the hall, she noticed Derek Lansing across the lane, pacing beneath the trees that lined the edge of the green. He saw her and gave a little wave. She crossed to him. "Miss Marple," he said with false brightness, "I was just walking, trying to clear my head. A fine place to do so, though I wonder why here." "Habit, I suppose?" She studied him. "I do wonder what you expected to find in St. Mildred's, Mr. Lansing." He blinked. "Sorry?" "Well, you came claiming family ties. But the Colonel never spoke of you. And then you inserted yourself rather quickly into the household. Curious behavior for someone shy of attention." "I didn't think I was, unwelcome." "Oh, not at all. But I did wonder at the timing. You appeared just before the Colonel's death, as if waiting for something." "I didn't—" He stopped himself, then exhaled. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing, Mr. Lansing, only observing." She smiled. "People often walk into places with a purpose, even if they don't quite know it themselves." He said nothing further. But when she turned away, she could feel his eyes on her back. That evening, Miss Marple hosted yet another tea, but this one was not for pleasantries. Inspector Reeves came. So did Reverend Blackwood and young Miss Birch, the schoolteacher who'd first raised the alarm when the Colonel hadn't turned up for the Harvest Committee meeting. Even Constable Haddon, normally too tongue-tied for company, was invited in and given a scone. Miss Marple passed the sugar and made pleasant conversation, waiting until the teacups were nearly drained. Then she said, "I think the chimney has told us everything." Reeves looked up sharply. "Has it?" She nodded. "It smoked not because it was faulty, but because it was forced to—" Blackwood frowned. "Deliberately?" "Oh, yes. Someone lit a fire not to warm the room, but to send a signal. The question is, to whom? And for what purpose?" "What purpose?" Reeves leaned forward. "You believe there was a second person involved?" "I believe," she said softly, "that Colonel Fawcett died with the truth in his mouth and a lie in the air, and that someone, perhaps more than one someone, was terribly afraid of what might be revealed." There was a long pause. "Tomorrow," Miss Marple continued, "I shall ask a small favor of you, Inspector. We must gather everyone, Mrs. Culpeper, Marion, Mr. Lansing, and young Elsie Dobbins. I believe it's time we had a little talk, a sort of village council." Reeves nodded slowly. "And you'll be leading it?" She gave him a mild smile. "I'll be knitting. But yes, I think I shall." Late that night, as the wind finally brought the promised rain, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, one lamp burning low. The wooden chimney sweep was beside her, and the anonymous photograph rested in her lap. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, not knitting this time, but sorting through a stack of old letters notes she'd taken, names jotted in corners. Fragments of memory collected across a lifetime of tea parties and tragedies. She paused over one envelope, the corner smudged with what looked like soot. Then she closed the basket, stood, and walked to the hearth. She did not light the fire. She only looked at the blackened edges where the coal once glowed, and whispered to herself, "You signaled the wrong person, my dear." But I heard it loud and clear. The rain had passed in the early hours, leaving the village of St. Mildred's freshly scrubbed, as though the heavens themselves wished to offer a clean slate. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to mistake a polished veneer for peace. More often than not, evil made itself most at home beneath charming hedgerows and sunlit gables. At precisely 3 o'clock, just as the church bell tolled its soft and dignified peal, the parlor at the vicarage filled with the scent of lavender biscuits and warm ginger tea. Reverend Blackwood, ever obliging, had lent Miss Marple the vicarage sitting room for her little informal tea gathering. Not that he knew its true purpose. The guests arrived in ones and twos. First came Marion Fawcett, pale but composed in a navy dress with a lace collar. She looked as though she hadn't slept, and her eyes avoided the fireplace altogether. Then Mrs. Culpeper arrived with the stiff determination of someone who suspected she had been summoned for judgment. She clutched her handbag like it might contain a talisman against questions. Young Elsie Dobbins entered next, face flushed from the walk, eyes darting. She took a seat near the door as though ready to bolt at any moment. Finally, Derek Lansing appeared last, his usual charm visibly diminished, his shoulders slightly hunched. Inspector Reeves, seated discreetly in the corner, was dressed in plain clothes. He sipped his tea as if merely part of the gathering, but Miss Marple knew he had a notebook in his coat pocket and was already watching everything. "I do thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began, her voice light. "I felt, given all that's happened, that a shared cup of tea might help us sort things out, clear the air, as it were." No one answered. The only sound was the clink of a spoon in a teacup. "I understand," she continued, "that the chimney at Ashcroft Hall has caused rather a bit of trouble. So much trouble, in fact, that it managed to speak in its own way." Mrs. Culpeper gave a loud sniff. "Chimneys don't speak, Miss Marple." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but they do smoke." And this one did so with remarkable timing. She turned slightly, addressing no one in particular. "When Colonel Fawcett's body was discovered, there was some confusion as to why no one noticed his absence sooner. But I believe one person did notice days before he was found. They saw the chimney smoking when the fire should not have been lit, and that person acted. Elsie's teacup rattled against its saucer. I never said that," she whispered. Miss Marple turned to her gently. "You didn't have to, dear. But you were the one who told Miss Birch that the colonel hadn't attended the committee meeting. And you insisted something was wrong. You saw the smoke, didn't you?" I thought maybe he was home and hadn't come out. But then I saw the curtains hadn't moved for days. The colonel always opened them in the morning, even in summer." "Very good," Miss Marple said, nodding. "A fine observation." Reeves said nothing, but Miss Marple saw the faintest shift in his posture. He was listening carefully now. She moved on. "There was a fire lit deliberately. Not for comfort, but to burn something. A document, perhaps a letter, or more likely a will." Marion's eyes flickered. "A will?" Mrs. Culpeper asked. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively mild. You see, Colonel Fawcett had spoken to me several months ago, before his health worsened. He said he'd been planning to update his will. He didn't mention details, of course, but he said he was making arrangements that would raise some eyebrows. A silence fell. I believe he meant to leave Ashcroft Hall to someone other than his blood relatives. Perhaps even to the village, or someone unexpected. Miss Marple's gaze settled gently on Derek Lansing. He met her eyes, then looked away. And when he died, she continued, someone panicked. They had reason to believe the old will? Worse, a new one would ruin everything, so it was removed. And burned. That's speculation, Derek said quietly. There's no proof. No, Miss Marple agreed, not yet. But then there's the matter of the photograph. Everyone looked up, even Reeves. Miss Marple reached into her knitting basket and drew it out a small, faded image, creased at the edges, but still sharp enough to make its meaning clear. It showed Colonel Fawcett standing beside a young man in uniform. The man bore a striking resemblance to Derek Lansing. Taken in 1946, Miss Marple said softly. The man beside the colonel was a soldier, his driver during the war. They corresponded for years afterward. But this isn't Derek. This is the real nephew. The silence was complete. It seems, Miss Marple said, folding the photo, away, that someone knew the colonel's real nephew was due to visit, perhaps even had written in advance. But when he didn't arrive, someone else did. A man who could impersonate a family connection and who stood to benefit from a generous will. Derek rose abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't, but Reeves had stood as well, slowly. We ran the name you gave us, he said. And there's no record of a Derek Lansing related to the Fawcett line. In fact, the real nephew is living in Canada and very much alive. He'd written only 2 weeks before the colonel died. Miss Marple poured herself another half-cup of tea. It's always dangerous to assume the elderly don't keep correspondence, especially in a village like ours where letters are as precious as memory. Marian sat frozen, her face white. But there's more, Miss Marple said, still calmly. This wasn't the first lie, was it? Mrs. Culpeper gave a tiny moan. The cleaning schedule was altered. The housekeeper's records, very meticulous, by the way, show that the colonel suddenly canceled several cleaning days. Convenient if one needed time alone in the house, or if the person answering the door was not the colonel at all. She looked at Marian now. You knew something was wrong, didn't you? Marian opened her mouth, then shut it. Her lips trembled. He told me he had a visitor, she whispered. Said it was a distant cousin staying briefly. I didn't question it, but he seemed different, Miss Marple pressed. Changed, unsettled, Marian nodded. Yes, but I thought maybe he was just lonely. Miss Marple stood slowly, gathering her knitting. I believe Colonel Fawcett was killed because he realized the truth too late, and once he did, the game was already in motion. The will burned, the chimney smoking. A perfect lie, hidden beneath the very rooftop he loved. She turned to Reeves. I believe you'll find the real will was rewritten only a month prior. Perhaps there's a copy still with his solicitor. But it won't favor Mr. Lansing. Derek didn't speak. He only stared at the floor. I've done what I can, Miss Marple said, lifting her shawl. Now the rest is yours, Inspector. As the gathering dispersed, the wind began to stir again, soft but steady, and in the garden of the vicarage, where lavender had bloomed late this year, the air carried a new stillness. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the weight of certainty pressing upon her gently but undeniably. The truth, like chimney smoke, had risen, and now it could no longer be hidden. The following morning dawned overcast, with low-hanging clouds that hovered over the rooftops of St. Mildred's like brooding thoughts. Miss Marple stood at her bedroom window, her tea cooling slightly on the sill beside her, and watched as a pair of jackdaws caught above the church tower. She was not given to poetic notions, but something in the oppressive weight of the sky pressed upon her an instinct, as she liked to call it. The truth, though nearly unearthed, still had its roots tangled in the dark. She turned back to her writing table. Before her lay a copy of the Times, a half-knitted woolen sock, and a small envelope yellowed at the edges and sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp. It had arrived that morning, tucked discreetly into her post by the vicar's housekeeper, who claimed it had been found beneath the cushions of one of the parlor chairs after yesterday's tea. No one had claimed it. Miss Marple, wary of tampering with potentially personal correspondence, had nonetheless opened it carefully, feeling something peculiar in the paper's stiffness. It was a note, brief and in a tidy, masculine hand. F. We cannot continue like this. I've done what you asked. But she's getting suspicious, and I refuse to be the scapegoat. If you don't act, I will. D. She read the note once, then again. The ink bled slightly in one corner, as if the writer had pressed too hard in haste. But it was the signature D. That was unmistakable. Derek Lansing. Yet it wasn't the name that intrigued her most, it was the salutation. F, not M for Marion. Not C for culprit F. Could it be for Fawcett himself? Or someone else? By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made up her mind. She would visit Inspector Reeves. He received her in his modest office at the village constabulary, a squat brick building tucked between the bakery and the post office. Lace curtains framed the windows, giving the room a homely air, as if one had stepped into a drawing room. Rather than a place of law, Reeves rose as she entered. Miss Marple, I've just wired the solicitor in London. We should soon receive confirmation about the change in Colonel Fawcett's will. Excellent, she replied, drawing the letter from her handbag. But I believe this may advance our timeline even further. She handed it to him. Reeves read the note twice, his brow creasing as he did. Where did you find this? Or rather, Miss Marple replied, it found me. Left behind either deliberately or carelessly. In either case, I don't believe. Mr. Lansing intended anyone but its recipient to read it. So he was working with someone, Reeves muttered. It would appear so, she said. Someone whose name begins with F, Fawcett, he offered. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Colonel Fawcett was the obstacle in their path, not an accomplice, Reeves considered. Fawcett's housekeeper Lydia Wills, her maiden name perhaps? I checked, Miss Marple replied with a trace of satisfaction. She was born a Wills and remains one. But what of Florence Culpepper? Reeves leaned back in his chair. Now that's interesting. Isn't it just? She said mildly. She had regular access to Ashcroft Hall, and I dare say she and Derek Lansing were more than a little familiar. Her voice dropped slightly. Too familiar for someone who claimed to dislike young men altogether, and Derek in particular. Reeves tapped the letter. This changes things. It does, Miss Marple agreed. I think it's time we paid Mrs. Culpepper another visit. Florence Culpepper answered the door of her rose-covered cottage with her usual air of brisk efficiency. Her mouth formed a tight line, lips pressed in polite disapproval. I'm quite busy today, Miss Marple. The church flowers, those lila from the Turners, are half rotted. Miss Marple smiled cheerfully, undeterred. I thought I might borrow your advice on gooseberry cordial. Mine always turns out far too sweet. Florence hesitated, then relented. 5 minutes. Inside, the scent of lavender polish and ripe pears lingered, a fragrance Miss Marple had long associated with genteel repression. She seated herself primly on a chintz-covered armchair while Florence retrieved a dusty decanter and 2 glasses. Delightful, Miss Marple murmured as she sipped. So reassuring when a recipe never fails, unlike one's friends. Or neighbors. Or letters. Florence stiffened. Oh, yes, Miss Marple continued lightly. Letters can be quite troublesome, especially when they're not meant to be read. The decanter met the tray with a sharper clink than necessary. What exactly are you implying? Nothing at all, Miss Marple replied, eyes twinkling. Only that I happened upon such. A letter yesterday, at the vicarage. Most enlightening. She withdrew the folded note and handed it over. Florence's face drained of color as her eyes scanned the page. I don't know what this is. No? Miss Marple asked gently. Someone is trying to frame me. Miss Marple said nothing. Florence's hands trembled. That man Derek, he deceived us all. But I had no part in anything criminal. Yet he wrote to you. He claimed you asked him to act. What was it, Mrs. Culpeper? She hesitated. I didn't ask him to hurt anyone. Only to watch the Colonel. He'd changed, grown distant. I thought perhaps he was hiding something. I wanted Derek to find out. And did he? Florence looked down at her lap. Yes, he discovered the Colonel had altered his will to leave everything to Marian. Miss Marple remained quiet. She bewitched him, Florence snapped. Pretended to be the devoted niece, but it was all selfishness. She didn't truly care for him. So you had Derek impersonate the nephew? To frighten him? No, her voice cracked. To stall him. We thought if we had time, we might persuade him to change his mind again. I didn't know Derek. Would actually kill him? Florence's face crumpled. I didn't know, she whispered. I never wanted this. Miss Marple's voice softened. Intent often hides behind fear. But consequences, she added gently, tend to speak for themselves. By late afternoon, Inspector Reeves had Florence Culpeper in custody. Not formally charged, but no longer free either. Miss Marple walked home beneath the shade of the tall hedge flanking her garden. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and rain yet to fall. She paused at her gate, fingers brushing the iron latch. The real nephew was on his way, summoned by telegram. Soon he would walk through the doors of Ashcroft Hall, not as a mystery, but as the rightful heir. Still, something remained unresolved. Impersonation, a murder, a tangled web of motives. And Miss Marple, seated later at her window with her knitting set aside, found her thoughts returning again and again to one person, Marian Fawcett, so quiet, so unreadable. She reached for a blank sheet of notepaper and began to write. The afternoon. Light dimmed, as if the village of St. Mildred's itself was holding its breath. Sunlight filtered through patchy clouds, casting pale shadows across the gravel drive leading to Ashcroft Hall. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the front door, the familiar scent of damp earth and roses rising from the garden. Marian Fawcett opened the door herself. Her composure had returned since their last meeting, but something remained locked in her expression, restraint, or perhaps resignation. Miss Marple, she said quietly, I wasn't expecting you. Neither was I expecting such unsettled weather, Miss Marple replied kindly. But sometimes a visit clears the air more than any storm. Marian led her into the sitting room, where the aroma of lavender mingled with the sharper tang of old paper and polished wood. The room was tidy, but bore the subtle signs of recent disturbance. A chair not quite aligned, a book left open and face down on a side table. Tea, Marian offered. I'd be delighted. As Marian busied herself with the tray, Miss Marple took in the details. The photograph of Colonel Fawcett on the mantel, stiff, proud, military, the cracked spines of novels, well read. The silence that settled like a question waiting to be asked. Marian returned and poured the tea with steady hands. It's kind of you to come, she said softly. Miss Marple inclined her head. I believe we have much to talk about, don't we? Marian's gaze flicked toward the cold fireplace. It's odd, she murmured. The chimney should have smoked. But it didn't. That was the first sign, I think, that something had gone wrong. Miss Marple nodded. The chimney's silence can speak volumes, a signal, a warning. Or perhaps a lie. Marian looked down. He changed. The Colonel. He became distant, withdrawn. At times afraid of what? Of losing everything? His home, his authority, even his dignity, and perhaps afraid of someone close. Miss Marple leaned forward. Someone he trusted? Marian's fingers tightened around her teacup. Yes, she hesitated, then continued. I was his niece. I cared for him. I thought I knew him. But in the end, we all failed him. Miss Marple said nothing. Marian's voice dropped. We never meant for harm to come to him. We only wanted more time. To stop him from making a decision we thought was wrong. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. And the letter from Derek? Marian shook her head. I never received it. I didn't even know he'd written one. But surely you sensed something was amiss? I did. The whispers. The stolen. Glances. I felt trapped in a house of secrets. Miss Marple allowed the silence to rest. "And the will?" she asked at last. "Do you know where the real will is?" "No," Marian whispered. "He never told me. I fear it may be lost forever." "Or hidden," Miss Marple said softly. "People often hide the truth in the places they think no one will look." Marian offered a small, wistful smile. "That sounds rather like life, doesn't it?" Miss Marple stood and smoothed her skirt. "Indeed it does, my dear. Indeed it does. It does. Thank you for your honesty, Marian. Sometimes the truth is the heaviest burden of all." Marian stood as well. "I want to make things right. If I can," Miss Marple smiled. "And you will." In time, after leaving Ashcroft Hall, Miss Marple took a slow walk back through the village. The sun had emerged fully now, casting a gentle warmth that softened the day's earlier chill. She paused near the village green, watching a pair of children chasing each other among the flower beds. Their laughter was light and untroubled, a stark contrast to the tangled web she had spent months unraveling. Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The puzzle was nearly complete. The pieces of deception, greed, and fear lay scattered like autumn leaves at her feet. But one question remained. What had truly happened in that silent room behind the cold chimney? Who had pressed the final ember into the dying coal, and why? That evening, as Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire with her knitting basket at her side, a soft knock came at her door. It was Elsie Dobbins, the former housemaid from Ashcroft Hall, looking pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," Elsie said. Hesitantly, "There's something I should have told you before." Miss Marple beckoned her inside. "Please sit. What is it?" Elsie took a deep breath. "The night the Colonel died, I saw someone in the hall moving toward the library, but it wasn't who anyone expected." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who was it?" Elsie hesitated. "It was Marian." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "Why did you keep this to yourself?" "I was scared, and I didn't want to believe it, but now I can't stay silent." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Thank you, Elsie. Sometimes the truth takes time to surface, but when it does, it clears the darkest shadows." The night deepened around St. Mildred's. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting forgotten. The chimney might not have smoked, but the embers were glowing still. And soon, very soon, the whole truth would burn bright. The days stretched on with the slow certainty of autumn's approach. The once vibrant leaves of St. Mildred's began their transformation, bright golds and fiery reds fading to brittle brown underfoot. The village carried on, though the shadow of Colonel Fawcett's death lingered like a stubborn fog. Miss Marple, however, had not been idle. She had spent much of her time reviewing the fragments of conversations, the letters, the quiet observations she had collected over the weeks. The anonymous photograph, the letter from Derek Lansing, Mrs. Culpepper's reluctant admissions, and now Elsie Dobbins' startling disclosure all formed a tapestry she was only beginning to see clearly. One cool morning, Miss Marple set off for the village solicitor's office. The building stood modestly beside the post office, its small sign swinging gently in the breeze. Mr. Hemingway, the solicitor, was a man of precise habits and a reputation for discretion. Miss Marple found him in his usual place behind a cluttered desk, his spectacles perched low on his nose. "Good morning, Mr. Hemingway," she began, settling into the chair opposite. "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity." "Miss Marple," he said, smiling politely, "how may I assist you today?" She placed a folded letter on his desk, the handwriting unmistakable. "This was sent to you recently, was it not?" He examined the letter and nodded. "Yes, from the late Colonel Fawcett himself, if you will believe it. Do you have a copy of the most recent will?" she asked carefully. He hesitated a moment, then retrieved a document from a locked drawer. "This is it. Dated just over a month before the Colonel's death." Miss Marple unfolded the paper, scanning the text with practiced eyes. The will left Ashcroft Hall to Marian Fawcett, with a generous provision for the village church and the local school. It named no relatives. "Quite a change," she murmured. Was there any indication why? Mr. Hemingway shrugged. Colonel Fawcett was a private man. He gave few explanations. But someone must have known, Miss Marple pressed. Gently, was the will ever discussed? There was talk, he said, mostly in hushed tones. Some found it scandalous. Others were supportive? Supportive? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Miss Marian herself, I believe. The solicitor cleared his throat. There was one peculiar detail, Miss Marple. The will was witnessed by a Mrs. Culpeper. That might be of interest. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a slight smile. Yes, I thought as much. Later that day, Miss Marple visited Florence Culpeper again. This time armed with the new information. Mrs. Culpeper's face paled when Miss Marple mentioned the will. It was my duty, Mrs. Culpeper said stiffly. To stand witness, I did what was necessary. But did you know the contents? Miss Marple asked softly. Florence's eyes darted away. Not entirely. The colonel was secretive. And yet you were involved in keeping the will from becoming public? I only wish to protect the family's reputation. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Reputation is often a fragile thing. Mrs. Culpeper's hands trembled. You don't understand. The colonel was a complicated man. I do, Miss Marple said kindly. And so are the people who loved him. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Her knitting lay untouched as she considered the layers of deception. The impersonation of the nephew, the secret will, the silent chimney, all pieces of a puzzle that spoke of fear and greed, yes, but also of loyalty and betrayal. Her thoughts turned to Marian. The quiet strength she had seen in the woman, the conflicted grief. What had driven Marian to stay silent? To let lies spread? And what had she done in the dark hours before the colonel's death? The following morning brought a new development. Inspector Reeves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, looking both tired and determined. We've located the real nephew. He reported he's coming from Canada. We've arranged for him to arrive quietly to avoid any disturbance. Miss Marple nodded. Excellent. His presence may clear much confusion. Reeves frowned. But I'm not sure it will clear all suspicion. Mrs. Culpeper's involvement remains murky. And Derek Lansing is still missing. That is troubling, Miss Marple said. But I have a feeling the final pieces will fall into place. Soon, that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk to the village green. The sun shone weakly through a veil of clouds, casting long shadows. She found Elsie Dobbins seated on a bench, staring at the ground. Elsie, Miss Marple said gently, sitting beside her. You seem troubled? Elsie looked up, eyes wide. I keep thinking about that night, about Marian in the hall. I can't get it out of my mind, Miss Marple nodded. What do you think she was doing? Elsie shrugged. I don't know. But I'm scared. What if she knows more than she says? Sometimes, Miss Marple said softly. The most dangerous secrets are the ones people hide from themselves. As twilight descended, Miss Marple returned home and lit a candle. She laid out all the evidence she had gathered, letters, photographs, witness statements, the silent chimney, the altered will, the secret correspondence. And now, Marian's presence in the hall on the fatal night. It all pointed to one conclusion. The heart of the mystery was far more tangled than anyone suspected. And the truth, when it came, would test not only justice, but the very nature of trust and love. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and began again, her fingers steady and sure. The threads were all in place. Soon she would begin to weave. The final pattern. The village of St. Mildred's had settled into an uneasy calm. The early autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke that was at once comforting and haunting. The once bustling whisperings about Colonel Fawcett's death had dimmed, replaced by furtive glances and half-spoken suspicions. But Miss Marple sensed the storm beneath the surface had not yet broken. On this particular afternoon, the vicarage garden was bathed in soft, golden light. Miss Marple sat beneath the ancient oak, knitting quietly while her thoughts wove the strands of the mystery tighter with each passing moment. The garden was a sanctuary, yet even here the shadows clung, reminding her that appearances, like the chimney smoke, could deceive. A sharp rap on the gate interrupted her reverie. She looked up to see Inspector Reeves approaching, his expression grave but determined. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "there's been a development at Ashcroft Hall." She stood and gestured toward the house. "Please tell me everything." Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. The household staff moved silently, eyes lowered, as if the very walls held their breath. Miss Marple and Reeves were led to the library where Marian Fawcett waited. Her posture was poised, yet her eyes betrayed an undercurrent of tension. Reeves began, "We have received a report from the gardener. He found something buried beneath the hedge near the west wall." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, dust-covered box. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside lay a bundle of papers, yellowed and fragile, a journal, perhaps, or a letter folded with care. "I believe this belonged to Colonel Fawcett," Reeves said quietly. Miss Marple carefully extracted the top sheet and began to read aloud. "To whoever finds this, know that the truth is not always where it seems. The chimney that does not. Smoke is the most dangerous, for it hides the fire beneath." Marian's breath caught. Miss Marple continued, "It seems the Colonel left this as a final warning. A clue, perhaps, or a confession." Marian's voice was barely a whisper. "I never knew. Never knew. He wrote such things." Reeves looked sharply at Marian. "Do you understand the meaning, Mrs. Fawcett?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, it means someone pretended all was well while in reality." "Everything was burning." Miss Marple placed the papers on the table. "The chimney should have smoked to show a fire was burning. Its silence was a signal, a lie." Reeves paced the room. "We know Derek Lansing lied about his identity. Mrs. Culpeper admitted to conspiring with him, and now this." Miss Marple looked from one to the other. "But these are pieces of a larger puzzle," she turned to Marian. "There is one thing we have not yet discussed." Marian's eyes met hers. "What is that?" "The moment of the Colonel's death. Where were you?" Marian's composure faltered. "I was in the hall. I wanted to speak with him." "To try once more," Miss Marple nodded. "Elsie saw you." "You were not alone." Marian swallowed. "No, I wasn't." Reeves's voice was steady. "Who else was there?" Marian hesitated, then said softly, "Florence Culpeper." A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple spoke gently. "Mrs. Culpeper and Derek Lansing were involved in much fear, deception, and regret. But there is one truth we must face." She stepped closer to Marian. "Did you do something in those final moments?" Marian looked down, tears shimmering. "I tried to stop them, but I was too late." Reeves asked quietly, "What happened?" Marian's voice cracked as she answered. "The Colonel confronted Derek. They struggled. I tried to intervene, but in the chaos, he was pushed or fell." "It was an accident." Miss Marple took Marian's hand in hers. "Sometimes accidents are the most tragic of all." Reeves's gaze softened. "Thank you, Mrs. Fawcett. Your honesty will help us bring peace." Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves, carrying away some of the heaviness. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the puzzle nearly complete. The silent chimney, the hidden will, the tangled relationships, all had led here. She reflected on human nature, the delicate balance between love and fear, truth and deception. The village of St. Mildred's would never be quite the same. But perhaps, now, it could begin to heal. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her hands steady. The final chapter was ready to be written. The morning mist lingered low over St. Mildred's as the village stirred to another day. Yet a quiet expectancy hung in the air, an invisible weight, as if the very trees and hedgerows anticipated what was to come. At Ashcroft Hall, the drawing-room had been cleared for what Inspector Reeves referred to as a matter of final clarity. Miss Marple sat in a straight-backed chair, her delicate lace gloves folded neatly in her lap. Across from her were seated Marian Fawcett, Florence Culpeper, Derek Lansing, whose real name was now known to be George Archer, and a few other village figures, the vicar, Dr. Penrose, and Miss Emily Torrance, whose sharp tongue was unusually silent. Inspector Reeves stood near the fireplace, the same fireplace that had refused to smoke. "I've asked you all here," Reeves began, Because we believe the events surrounding Colonel Fawcett's death have been misunderstood or more accurately, deliberately misrepresented. A murmur stirred through the room. Reeves nodded to Miss Marple. Miss Marple has kindly offered to lay out her observations. She stood with quiet dignity. Thank you, Inspector. I do not claim to have the answers, but I have noticed certain details which, when assembled, point in a clear direction. She turned to the room. Let us begin with what first struck me as odd. A chimney that should smoke did not. That small detail, it was not only mechanical but symbolic. Something was being hidden, covered, smothered. Miss Marple paced slowly. Colonel Fawcett was found dead, supposedly of a stroke, and yet there was that smear of blood behind the ear. Explained away as incidental, yes, but blood always means force. Derek Lansing shifted uncomfortably. Then there was the question of the will. A second version, unsigned but damaging, buried beneath a hedge. Why bury a draft unless it contradicted your interests? Derek opened his mouth, but Miss Marple raised her hand lightly. Patience, Mr. Archer. You will have your moment. She looked to Florence Culpeper. You, madam, were the linchpin. You helped Mr. Archer assume a false identity, posed as his aunt. You had hoped that by placing him near Colonel Fawcett, he could ingratiate himself and gain a portion of the estate. But that plan failed. Florence said nothing, but her silence was an admission. Miss Marple continued. Colonel Fawcett was not a trusting man. When he suspected something was amiss, he began writing down his thoughts, hence the journal. Pages found hidden. He began preparing a revised will that would cut out his niece Marian and Mr. Archer entirely. Why? Because he believed them both complicit in the deception. Marian gasped. That's not true. Miss Marple turned to her kindly. No, my dear. I believe your complicity was assumed, not actual. Colonel Fawcett may have misunderstood your involvement due to your past connection with Mr. Archer, which I believe was rekindled during his stay. Marian looked down, face flushed. And then came the night of the incident, Miss Marple continued. We know there was a confrontation in the drawing room, but what truly happened? Colonel Fawcett confronted Mr. Archer, likely with his suspicions. A struggle ensued. She looked directly at Archer. You struck him. Derek's jaw tightened. It was an accident. He grabbed me. I shoved him away. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely, not premeditated, but the result was fatal. He fell, struck the corner of the marble hearth. The blood confirms it. Inspector Reeves interjected. The autopsy results corroborate this. Blunt force trauma, not a stroke? Marian's voice broke the hush. I tried to stop them. I was there, Florence and we both saw it. Florence finally spoke. We didn't know what to do. Derek panicked. He wanted to flee. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Instead, you conspired to cover it. You altered the room. Burned the Colonel's unfinished will in the fire. But the chimney, unused for years, refused to draw. She pointed toward the fireplace. The smoke didn't rise. It seeped back into the room. A symbol, a warning. Derek stood. You don't understand. The Colonel was planning to ruin me. I'd invested everything. I was desperate. Miss Marple's expression did not soften. Desperation explains behavior, Mr. Archer, but it does not excuse it. Inspector Reeves stepped forward. Mr. Archer, you are under arrest for the unlawful death of Colonel Gerald Fawcett and for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Florence Culpeper, you will be taken in for questioning. There was a sudden flurry of movement as the officers escorted them out. The room fell into silence once more. The vicar cleared his throat. What of the will, Miss Marple? She smiled. Gently. The burnt copy may be gone, but the draft recovered along with the Colonel's journal will assist the probate court in establishing intent. I believe Marian will be treated fairly. Marian, pale but composed, whispered, I didn't know he was capable of that. Derek, Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. Sometimes it takes a fire to reveal what lies beneath the soot. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The kettle whistled softly. On the hob and the quiet tick of the clock marked the passage of another solved puzzle. She poured her tea and settled into her chair. Outside, the chimney on her own cottage gave off a steady plume of white smoke, uncomplicated, honest, and visible. She reflected on the many masks people wore. The smoke that didn't rise had tried to hide a death, but smoke, like guilt always, finds a way to escape. With a sigh of satisfaction, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. The storm had passed, and as always, she had seen the pattern long before anyone else. The end. The end.